last 9 years. Got to get that down. And I'd like to wish you all a very hearty welcome and a very happy 4th of July weekend here in the States. But before we begin our presentation with question and answer period at the end, I am delighted to be able to say that Gus Noble, president of Caledonia and the Chicago Scots, is with us today to greet everyone and say a few words. And Gus, I'm going to embarrass you. Gus was recently made an officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, or an OBE, by Her Royal Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Gus, congratulations. And I'm hoping you're going to tell us a little bit about this, please.
Thank you, Connie. Good morning, everyone. I have two cameras going because I realized that my computer camera makes my face look very, very red. So
I can't see you at all, Gus. Oh, there you are. I see you now. Sorry.
You're on my phone. So if I look in different directions, I apologize. I'm delighted that Alastair's here this morning. Alastair, it's great to see you, and you bring back great memories of one of the fondest periods of my life when I was at Stirling University. And please, if you would say hello to everyone at Stirling for me.
Will do. And Gus, you still have a Scottish accent, which is very encouraging.
It's difficult. No, I hang out with a lot of people who have the accent, so they keep it real. You know, Connie, you're very kind to mention the OBE. It was something that was very humbling and moving, and you know, I'm flabbergasted when the Consul General called me, and of course I'm very chuffed. But it's not singularly for me at all. It's really an award that goes to everybody in the community. It goes to you, Connie. It goes to Jack. Everybody at the in our Scottish community that's done so much to nourish Scottish identity and keep a feeling of connection to Scotland here in Chicago. And most especially, I think it goes to the people who are the most important people in my life, aside from my family, the residents and staff of Caledonia Senior Living, who have done incredible work to keep COVID from the doors of the Scottish Home in McLean House, and for that I'll be eternally grateful of them, grateful to them, and proud of them. So it's an award that I'll proudly accept on their behalf and on your behalf, if I might, if you'll let me. I am so thrilled that Alastair is going to be speaking to us today, because as I said, the days I spent at Stirling University were some of the most important in my life. It made me who I am, and certainly I had a lot of fun while I was there. I feel like my Scottish identity was formed in large measure by my experience at Stirling, and as we kind of approach the 4th of July, I think about my identity as an American. And I'm certainly a Chicago Scot. I am a blend, and my family is a blend of Scotland and America. Aisha is American. I'm Scottish. I'm now an American as of April 2018. And our sons are named after poets, one Scottish and one American, Bobby and Langston, after Robert Burns and Langston Hughes. So I like to think we've taken the best of both parts of Scotland and the United States and formed a wonderful family. And today is my wedding anniversary. So we're going to be going to Garfield Park later today, where we tied the knot, and we'll have some fun with our Scottish American family. So regards to everyone. Happy 4th of July. Aisha's in the other room, and I'll say happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, Aisha.
Thank you.
We do that.
And I'll thank you very much. And Alastair, I'm really thrilled that you're going to be speaking to us. And I'll be quiet now and over back to Connie. Thank you.
Well, Gus, thank you. And again, congratulations, not only on the OBE, but on your anniversary. That's so fun.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, I believe it's time to move forward with our presentation, and we are thrilled to have with us live from Scotland, Professor Alastair Mann, Senior Lecturer, Department of History at the University of Stirling. And Alastair is going to speak to us on King James.
Your sound went there, Connie.
Connie, you went on mute.
You muted yourself by accident.
Well, I didn't touch anything. Must have been the pitch of my voice. So I will just rewind quickly that Alastair is the Senior Lecturer in the Department of History from the University of Stirling. He's speaking to us today live from Scotland, and he's going to speak to us on King James II and the seventh, the Forgotten Jacobite. And Alastair, we'd prefer that you introduce yourself, please. And we're hoping you won't hold back because we'd love to know about your history and your current pursuits. But before we start the lecture, Jack Sanders is going to state the logistics surrounding the presentation today. Jack?
Thank you, Connie. Hi, everyone. Morning. Just a couple little things to get out of the way. We are going to be recording this. We're already recording, just an FYI to everybody. I'd ask everybody to please go on mute for right now until the presentation is over and we can start the Q&A portion. And that is all. Thank you, Connie.
Okay, and I do want to point out the relevance of Alastair's topic on this, the celebration weekend of America's independence, by the way. Alastair, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Gus, for welcoming me. You have beat me in two ways. Firstly, there are two camera squares representing you on the screen when I only have one. And the second one is that I recently had my 45th wedding anniversary, and believe it or not, I forgot to put it in my diary. So there you go. So you are a better man than me. Anyway, let me explain what I'm about. I was born in Aberdeen, as most of you will know where that is, technically part of Lowland Scotland. I was educated at Aberdeen Grammar School, one of the oldest schools in Scotland. I'm not quite as old as it is. It's a 13th century school when it started. And then I educated in Edinburgh, worked as a managing editor at Penguin Books for 12 years in book publishing. And then I decided to change my life and gather my sanity again and move away from London and back to Scotland, and educated myself again as an historian at Stirling, and then began a 30-year association with Stirling as a student, a PhD student, and a member of staff. My interests are obviously book history, first of all, because it made sense to carry my publishing interests into historical studies. The early book between 1500 and 1800 in Scotland, and then got into other projects to do with parliamentary history, the 17th century, Restoration Scotland, and then it came one day to doing a book about James VII, because as many continental colleagues say to me, come on, Alastair, there can't possibly be 7 Scottish kings called James. Yes, there are, and I've pumped for the last one. But in many history books that you will read, he's seen as James II because he's the second James of England. Anyway, that's kind of my sort of history. The latest stuff is that I retired in August 19, and then I suddenly unexpectedly got a huge research grant, the largest one that Stirling has got in the last decade. And I'm now managing a project, so I'm back working with them again part-time on the Privy Council of Scotland, which is a kind of executive or the cabinet, if you like. And I'm doing a project with them with 7 members of staff. So I'm back more engaged with history again than perhaps Mrs. Mann would like, but I'm enjoying myself completely at the moment with that. So let me turn now to speak to you about James the 7th. Well, sorry, first of all, thank you, Chicago Scots, for inviting me, by the way, and thank you, Connie, for persisting with the invitation, if you see what I mean there, Connie. Anyway, nagging me.
Alastair, we've been chasing you for a long time.
I know. It's contact my agent, etc. I get it. Anyway, so today I want to speak to you about King James II of Scotland, 7th of Scotland, the king removed at the Revolution of 1689, sometimes called in England the Glorious Revolution. It's not called that in Scotland because of our ties with Jacobitism. He was exiled in France at that revolution, and of course was the first Jacobite, the father of Jacobitism. He's the origin of the label after all, James, Latin, Jacobus, and so Jacobitism. Jacobitism is one of those ideas often at the behest of the user, like all labels in politics, of course. It has also been subjected to myth-making, planted in the fertile soil of the history of Scotland. Just think about it. The bravery of Highlanders, anti-English feeling, resentment at the death of clan society, and so on. In reality, to be frank, Jacobitism was a minority sport, with most Scots in the 18th century favouring the other side.
Alastair, I
Yes.
apologize for interrupting, but if you have a presentation going, we cannot see it.
You're not due to see it yet, Connie.
Oh, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
I thought it might help if, to begin with, you could get the cut of my jib a bit more. All right, you can see me better. And then once you get bored with that, I'll move on to pictures. Anyway, as I say, these individuals, for a mixture of religious and political reasons, didn't favour Jacobitism. The romanticism of the Jacobite Highlander, however compelling, as depicted in the popular series Outlander, of course, has created exaggerated ideas of patriotism when both sides thought they were patriots with God on their side. I suggest the American Civil War would be an example of that, would it not? The extent to which the subject of today was Scottish is also subject to interpretation and will be another plank of this particular talk. And oddly, he's been almost forgotten in the pantheon of Jacobite leaders. Perhaps an unfortunate embarrassment to the cause. He's neither a pretender or bonny like Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was a Catholic when kings of England and Scotland had to be Protestant, even though he only converted to Rome in the 1660s with his first wife, Anne Hyde. On the other hand, perhaps in more ways than mere label making, to get Jacobitism started, it needed its James. Now I'm going to try and engage you with my PowerPoint slides. We'll see how that goes. Can you see them?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah, excellent. Amazing. Let no man miss his glass of stealth, but all with one consent agree to drink a brimmer to the health of James the Duke of Albany. So went a song sung by Scotland's bishops when toasting the health of James, Duke of Albany and York, his title before he became king. The Duke of Albany being the title for the second oldest son and heir, just as the Duke of York is the title for the second eldest son and heir in England. How optimistic. This was in February 1680, according to Sir William Stewart of Newton Stewart, when writing to his London friends, reporting on the welcome that James received in exile in Scotland. Exiled? Yes, exiled as a result of the exclusion crisis, the attempt by the English parliamentarians to exclude the Catholic James from succeeding his brother Charles II. Stewart sought to quash various rumours, including that the ears of one of the Duke's servants had been cut off. Far from this, one of James's English servants had been wandering around Edinburgh drunk. On being challenged by a Scottish soldier on watch, the servant responded in a saucy manner, was locked up for the night and released in the morning. As a result of this, James sacked the servant and thanked the soldier for his duty. In another incident in 1681, Scotland's the commander-in-chief in Scotland, General Dalyell, issued an order in the manner it is said of his service in Russia, that a guard be shot who fell asleep at the gate of Edinburgh's Holyrood Palace as James entered. The sentence was remitted at the Duke's special request. These incidents and the bishop's song confirm the generalized attachment that James had for Scottish soldiers on royal service and a loyal clergy. So, how do these strengths become weaknesses? How Scottish was this prince and king of Scots? Sorry, I don't know what was happening there. It was an odd noise. James can, like this mocking Don Pottinger cartoon from 1956, of his saintly bits scattered around the continent, be packaged in various ways. This was a visual pun at the expense of the fate of James's body parts post-mortem. Before he died in September 1701, James was asked to be buried at the parish church of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, west of Paris, very close to the palace of his French exile. But Louis XIV, the King of France, had other ideas. He insisted that James's body was embalmed and placed in a triple coffin to preserve it for burial at Westminster Abbey in London. Meanwhile, it was to be kept at the Benedictine monks of Paris, the English abbey, and unfortunately it was removed by French revolutionists in 1793 and became a tourist attraction before being destroyed the following year. 24 hours after James's death, the embalming process took place, and those present took mementos. Flesh from his arms, his hair, his heart, his brain, and numerous linen cloths were dipped in his blood. Many still survive. The heart went to the nuns of Charlotte near Paris, a favoured haunt of his second wife, Mary. His brain to the Scots College in Paris. His entrails were divided between the parish church of Saint-Germain, and are still there, and the English Jesuit College at Saint-Omer near Calais. All these survived the French Revolution. Many Jacobites, and not a few sympathetic Frenchmen, regarded James as a saint. It was believed that the intercession of Saint Roy d'Angleterre led to dozens of cases where individuals were cured of afflictions. And we have over 40 well-documented cases where the sick or the relatives spent lengthy vigils at his tomb. His skeptical brother Charles II would have found all this very amusing. The trouble with James is that he is at the center of so much historical controversy. Seeing the wood for the trees is a problem. The comparisons with his father, Charles I, and brother, Charles II. The crisis of the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 after years of the Covenanters in Scotland and Cromwell in Scotland and England. The fact of the revolution of 1689 itself. The birth and progress of Jacobitism and the parliamentary union between England and Scotland in 1707. And then we have other issues. Absolutism, kings versus parliaments, the European 17th century crisis, a crisis that was economic, military, and environmental. The growth of the slave trade out of West Africa, to which he was involved and much committed when gold and ivory were posted missing. Early party politics, the Whigs versus the Tories, the apparent victory of Protestantism over the Catholic faith. With all of these topics, his corpse is wheeled out and his life used to illustrate and to explain. He is the elephant in the corner in the stew of historical controversy that dominates his life and the period afterwards. So I'd like today to consider our elephant in three ways. Firstly, looking at his life, then his engagement with Scotland, and lastly, sit down in this psychiatrist chair and consider him as revealed by his writings, And given that I've written a biography of James, it's not surprising that I would want to get into his head, and perhaps he's got a bit into mine as well. Exactly a century since the palace was built by Henry VIII, James was born at St. James's Palace in London in 1633. At the height of his father Charles I's power, and just after he returned from the Coronation Parliament in Edinburgh, at which he confirmed his character by noting down the names of those members of the Scottish Parliament who voted against his policies, like a demented head prefect. James had a happy enough childhood, though he was better at his bow and arrow than his pen. Before the protracted wars against his father were begun by the Covenanters in Scotland in 1639. His father was reserved and his mother rigid, who always compared him unfavorably with his brother Charles, although in the 1650s, French women seemed to prefer James, his greater sincerity and his better French. When the English Civil War started in 1643, he was sporadically with his father and for a time at Oxford, the royalist headquarters, where some education took place. But soon in 1646, he found himself in parliamentary hands. But he managed to escape to the continent in spring 1648, and then spent 4 years cutting a frustrated figure for a young man of action, unable to influence matters to save his father from execution or restore the monarchy in the name of his brother. Lack of money, the convoluted politics of the exiled court, and ironic resentment at attempts by his mother to convert to the Church of Rome, James and his brothers Charles and Henry, all added to the general frustration. However, from 1652 to 1658, James joined and even commanded the armies of France and Spain. And though young, a mere 19 when this phase began, he showed remarkable ability and bravery. In 1660, after the death of Cromwell and the collapse of government by the army, James and his brothers were welcomed back, the population weary of military rule. Scots wished to free themselves from government by English officers. And James was very popular, and with his two brothers provided reassurance in terms of the succession, of course. He became English Lord Admiral in the Anglo-Dutch War of the 1660s and showed great courage under fire, and helped his brother Charles with their own hands to put out the famous Fire of London, of course. Also, in what seemed to confirm him as the champion of the Church of England, he married Anne Hyde, daughter of Clarendon, the English Chancellor, a stalwart Anglican. So when news spread of his Catholic conversion in the early 1670s, there was popular in court disappointment and disbelief. The political fallout was exacerbated when it became clear that Charles II and his wife Catherine were not going to have children. And Charles II made sure that James's daughters, Mary and Anne, were educated as Protestants and away from Catholic influence. The fact that James's second wife, married in 1673, was the Italian Catholic Mary of Modena, further depressed James's reputation. So by 1679, England was in the grip of that exclusion crisis I mentioned, and it seemed as if the crown would never pass to James. A period of exile in Scotland was seen by Charles II as a solution. And for most of the time, from October 79 to March 82, James resided in Edinburgh and presided over the Edinburgh Parliament in 1681, the only monarch to be both the king's agent in Scotland at the Parliament and a reigning monarch, of which problems later. His time in Scotland was viewed by contemporaries as a success, and the Scottish Parliament confirmed his right to this succession and did much else to help Scotland, especially in economic measures. So, when he became king in 1685, his succession was warmly welcomed by most Scots as the continuation of the ancient royal line. And his time in Edinburgh had suggested there was no cause for alarm. The period of prosecution, the killing times, as it was known, from 1681 to 85, when the Covenanter Presbyterians of the southwest of Scotland were persecuted in their dozens and executed in their dozens, was partially forgotten, and was in any case a policy progressed by his older brother Charles. Even the Parliament of 1685 went well for James, and it was only in the 86th session the question of toleration for Catholics raised its head and became a problem. He failed to get the Parliament to agree to the statutory toleration, but laughed this off, happy to introduce it by royal edict. Then in the summer of 1688, a miraculous thing happened. After so many years, a son was born, James Francis Edward. And so the anticipated succession of the Protestant William of Orange and James's daughter Mary was now in question. And before long, a revolution came along, and James fled into exile at the end of 1688. And he and his family, he and his second family rather, set up in Saint-Germain, outside Paris, not far from Versailles. And there Jameson realized, after a failed Irish military adventure, that his own restoration was unlikely. To begin with, he used diplomacy, convoluted plots, the inconsistent interest of Louis XIV, the Pope, and other powers that were Catholic, but between 1693 and 6, settled down to concluding years of acceptance, of piety, of submission to his faith. The future belonged to his son. Just briefly, if you look at this slide, you'll see the extraordinary palace at Saint-Germain, a very awkward palace, actually, where you can imagine a situation with no lifts, where you either had to go downstairs or across the central courtyard to deliver things from room to room. A very awkward palace indeed, although it was the one that Louis XIV lived in before Versailles was built. It's rather remarkable, the fact that it was used, Napoleon used it as a cavalry headquarters. So it has a history. It's now a museum. For historians of Scotland and England, there is an awareness of the tensions between James as King of Scotland and the King of England. To some extent, the case I have made for Scotland in my biography and in other works I've done, it's to redress the balance of 300 years of Anglo-British history, as it is often called. At the onset, we have to admit that in Scotland, he had no property. Like his extensive Irish estates, which he managed extremely badly and let his tenants down, or official residence when Duke, like St. James's Palace and Richmond Palace in and around London. In spite of this, James's engagement with Scotland is not all about his time there. In the first decade after the Restoration of 1660, James became the champion of the bishops in Scotland and a conduit between the bishops of England and Scotland. Remarkably, even when his conversion to Rome was no secret, episcopal appointments to the Scottish Church were approved by James. Also, James had good relations with Scottish bishops on account of his support for measures to clamp down on conventicles, the illegal field meetings or field preaching meetings in Scotland of the Covenanters of the extreme wing in the Restoration period. James was also, more expectedly, the key patron for military appointments in Scotland, and long before his arrival there in 1679. The condition of Scotland's small army had been a source of frustration for him since the Restoration, as for most of the period, it came to less than 3,000 foot and horse. But that didn't mean it was uncontroversial. In the various militia plans of the time, the commissioning of officers and so on were left to the king, and for the most part, Charles relied on his brother. James also kept good relations with the officer class in Scotland, who he'd come to admire rather, from his experience in exile in the 1650s. And their confessional background varied. Amongst Catholics with whom James took a special interest was Andrew Rutherford, Earl of Teviot, who had served in the 1640s and 50s under the famous French generals, the Prince of Conde and Marshal Turenne. And at the Restoration, James ensured he was elevated to the peerage and made the governor of Tangier in 1663. Some Protestant officers came under James's wing. Former Civil War veterans included William Drummond of Cromlix, near me actually, locally, Viscount Strathallan, and Thomas Gerald of Binns, also not far from here. Two friends with almost parallel military careers. Both served under the Covenanters in Ireland in the 1640s, and for Charles II in 1651, when they were both captured but escaped, after which they ended up in Russia for 10 years in the service of Alexei I, the Tsar. When they returned home in 1665, under Charles's command and James's advice, the Earl was made the commander-in-chief in Scotland, and Drummond was his second man. James's relations with the Scottish soldiery can be illustrated through the careers of two contrasting people. These two guys, Sir James Turner and most famously John Graham of Claverhouse, immortalised as Bonnie Dundee. Turner began in Swedish service before joining the army of the Covenanters in the 1640s. Also served in Ireland in the 1640s before returning to Scotland. At the Restoration, under James's patronage, he was appointed a major in the King's Foot Guards in Scotland. Claverhouse, a Protestant like Turner, served for the French against the Dutch under the command of Turenne, but in the 1674 he changed sides, as many soldiers did in the 1650s. He then came to the attention of James, who ensured he was given command of a troop of horse in Scotland in 1678. And he was one appointed to subdue the Covenanting Southwest from 1678 to 9, hence his sobriquet, Bloody Clavers. However, Claverhouse was summoned to London and kept regular company with James and King Charles. The nature of James's relationship with these military men can further be explained through his attitudes to soldiering. With the instruction of his young son in mind, in 1700 and in health, only months before he died, James penned a series of instructions on military deployment and readiness. Turner, during his retirement, published in 1683 his military essays of the ancient art of war, a manual of warfare admired by James out of that same love of the ancient art. In the dedication to James, Turner describes the Duke as a great master in the art of war, as well as thanking him for princely favours. Claverhouse was extraordinarily loyal to James and is reported to have wept on the news of his master's flight to France. Occasionally, however, a more complicated relationship between soldier and general is revealed. In 1683, Claverhouse wrote, "The Duke thinks the army his own province, and that he understands about the men and business of it better than anybody, and he has his own maxims and it's hard to put him off them." In other words, James was insufferably opinionated about soldiering. He admired military debate and noted the opinions of Turner and the like, but his own beliefs were paramount. At times, the overriding concern for James was not religious or politics in his relations with soldiers, but in the fact of soldiering itself. He was, though, the most significant influence on the Scottish military in the Restoration period. In that Restoration period, James's own military reputation rested more on the navy rather than his army experiences, even though there was little scope for such adventures in the Northern Kingdom. Nevertheless, he was appointed Lord Admiral of Scotland in the very year he resigned from the English equivalent on account of the Protestant oath he could not take. And this left some possibilities for patronage in Scotland, as well as confirming the attempt to prevent James from succeeding his brother. The exclusion crisis was mostly an English business. James took the chance to appoint trusted royal servants to arbitrary posts in Scotland, but also chaired a council of trade that advised the 1681 Scottish Parliament on a new statute of jurisdiction for the Admiralty Court in Scotland, which remained in place until 1830, only 15 years before your organisation was started. I checked on, by the way, which is quite remarkable. So James had his impact on Scotland's peacetime business of the sea in unexpected ways. The other interest that James had before his residence there was the economy of Scotland. James's territories in the colonies, in New York, and his investment in the great English trading companies, he understood how important this could be for potential Scottish investors. Accordingly, James was able to convince the English Privy Council to allow Scots to share from the 1670s in the activities of the Royal Africa Company and the Hudson Bay Company, and to trade freely with New York. Also, in spite of many future difficulties, he supported and authorised new Scottish trading colonies in East New Jersey in 1683 and Carolina, South Carolina in 1684. Culturally, when James was in Scotland, he drank in the national pastimes. Frustratingly for him, it being his main diversion, the hunting in Scotland was modest. Stag hunting, near impossible because of the terrain, and hare hunting and shooting grouse on foot, a poor alternative. James was renowned for bounding from his horse and dispatching the helpless creature with his own blade, with remarkable enthusiasm. Yet in exile in France, he continued into his mid-60s with this sport, including the dangerous sport of bear hunting. In Scotland, he went riding most days, watching as a spectator at horse racing at Leith outside Edinburgh in 1680. He played golf regularly on Leith links, especially in clear winter days, and developed considerable skill. At one point, he took as his partner a shoemaker called Patterson, who was a sensation at the game. When he and James won their pairs, James let his partner keep the prize money. James also learned curling in the local frozen lochs. The Palace tennis court doubled up as a theatre, and his daughter Anne, who of course became queen herself one day, and his wife, ladies-in-waiting, including his mistress, Catherine Sedley, joined professional companies in performances. The Royal College of Physicians was patronised and founded in Edinburgh in 1681, thanks to James. He was the driving force behind the commissioning of 111 portraits of the kings of Scots with the Dutch painter Jacobite. These were painted between 1684 and 86 and were hung at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh and are still there, only to be damaged by disgruntled English soldiers in 1746. And while this collection is of dubious artistic and historical merit, going back as it does to the mythical King Fergus from 300 BC, and also all 111 portraits other than the last half dozen look remarkably similar, it represents an extraordinary example of royalist iconography, a theme dear to James's heart. Also, he recreated from its 15th century origins the Order of the Thistle, Scotland's order of chivalry, to compete with England's Order of the Garter. David Nairn, James's secretary at Saint-Germain, a Scot born in Fife in Scotland, reports in his journal that one day in April 1697, James sat with him early one morning and spoke of several places in Scotland, reminiscing of his 2 years in his northern kingdom, the circumstances of his Scottish exile quite forgotten. There is no doubt that he felt a close affinity with Scotland and a closer affinity than he did with Ireland. There is, of course, much evidence of a pride as an Englishman in what was an instinctive nationalism. My own father, curiously, was born in Bristol and lived most of his life in Scotland, and was always very keen on Scottish rugby and Scottish football. But in his latter years, found himself in Bristol with my brother watching an England-Scotland football match, and horrified my mother when England scored by jumping in the air and celebrating. So we can see how difficult it is to be an Anglo-Scot. But there we go. When in Scotland, James, though, occasionally let slip "that is not how we do things in England" comment. Nevertheless, he was acutely aware that his hereditary legitimacy depended on the ancient line of Scotland, the Stuart line. Moreover, as a Duke and King of Scots, James had more credibility than his father and brother. Not since James VI of Scotland, who of course became James I of England in 1603, had a monarch been so willing to engage with Scottish affairs, be they economic, military, cultural, or religious. Unlike Charles I and II, he established a significant party in his own personal interest, yet by unwise policies weakened it in the course of the 1680s. And even then, those remaining loyal were enough to make Scotland the most credible vehicle for counter-revolution, as it would be clearly for his son and grandson. Nevertheless, following the natural political priorities of James VI, the main orientation for James's policy had to be England. Meanwhile, as a King of Scots, James was the oldest to succeed since Robert III in 1390, and his experiences between 1679 and 82 should have found him able to handle the key imperative to Scottish politics, keeping the nobility loyal. In this sense, James's failure in Scotland was his most dramatic reverse, one disguised by later Jacobitism and its relative success and long life. In the North, enthusiastic expressions of loyalism gradually evaporated from late 1686. It was an extraordinary outcome for a Scottish prince of the blood, and resembled the disharmony and division of the reigns of James III and James V in the 15th and 16th centuries. James's natural ancestor was the more martial and more famous James IV, the multilingual king who died at Flodden in 1513, fighting for the French against the English, and immortalized in the famous folk song Flowers of the Forest, of course. Well, like James and that Renaissance prince have discussed military tactics and shared an obsession with heraldry and knightly valor. James IV, however, was a victim of the Anglo-Scottish problem, just as the kings and queens of the Union of the Crowns that began in 1603 and onwards. And whatever can be said of our King James, he was not a solution to that particular problem. In other words, he failed there where others would struggle before and after. In the third part of the talk, I'd like to talk or consider James's view of Scotland through his own writings, and especially his advice to his son of 1692. A document first published in full was with James Stanier Clark's edited Life of James II, printed in 1816. The advice comes to us as part of the Stuart papers held at Windsor Castle and acquired by the Prince Regent, later George IV, in 1813. James deposited the text with the Scots College in Paris, seen here, but it ended up in Rome through bonnie Prince Charlie's daughter, Charlotte, Duchess of Albany, and so avoided the fate of most of James's writings, destruction of the French Revolution. The exiled Stuarts never published the advice in full. To make it clear to you, the life of James II, half of it is written by James himself. The other half was written during his lifetime, when his clerks and secretaries had access to his papers. And the tradition of writing advice was long-standing for the crown heads of Europe. James traced it back to King Henry II of Castile in the 14th century. The Silicon Doron was written by his grandfather James VI as advice to his eldest son, Prince Henry, who died, which explains why Charles I succeeded. And Charles I co-wrote Ecod Basilicae, published in 1649, for his son, Charles II, which is more related to James VII's advice, reflecting as it does on a failed king. The printed, the late King James, his advice to his son of 1703, seen here, was heavily edited and removed references to James's sexual behavior, or at least the details of it. The original advice was viewed as more personal and publication awkward for an aspiring saint whose posthumous status was being promoted by clergy and a pious widow. When did James write this? Well, he wrote the advice in April 1692, before the attempted invasion of the British Isles that year by the French, accompanied by Scottish exiles. And he did so in case he was killed or captured. On the failure of his plans due to the French naval defeat at the Battle of La Hogue, represented here, James shelved the text until it was reactivated for propaganda purposes by his widow and son. His affairs were not in good order before or after the setback at La Hogue, and he could reflect on divine judgment encouraged by his contact with Catholicism when in exile. Soon after his arrival at Saint-Germain, he was introduced to Armand Jean de Reims, abbé of the Cistercian monastery of La Trappe in Normandy, who became his confidant and confessor and helped instill that quality of piety and fatalism that is found in the advice. De Reims and La Trappe brought about the strict observance of Trappist monks. James was impressionable and impressed. The advice contains 4 major themes, and the first is sin. The text shows James obsessed with the fact that his sins of the past account for his situation. For this reason, the most important thing is to serve God and, of course, the Church of Rome. His son must reject pride and ambition, as they are the sins of Lucifer. Take drink in moderation and put no trust in riches and honours. Wise advice, I guess. The most perilous danger, however, especially for princes, is forbidden love, for which he paid dear. His conversion has saved him, and is able to thank God for losing his kingdoms. A righteous punishment brings him nearer to God's grace. While we're at this slide, let me comment on this example of his handwriting. As somebody who's written a biography of James, I was so delighted that his handwriting was easy to read, as you can see here. Remarkably, earlier historians, especially in the first half of the 20th century, viewed his simple handwriting as an example of his being childish. I see it as an example of clear thinking, in fact, given that I'm somebody who my students will tell you has terrible handwriting, which is almost illegible. So there we go. Anyway, James, like his brother Charles II, certainly had a voracious appetite for women. When in Dublin in 1690, while preparing for his fateful Battle of the Boyne against William of Orange, he arranged for Irish mistresses while his wife Mary was in France raising troops and money for the cause. James had a strong libido, like many a crown prince, but what matters here is how he viewed his sexual past in 1692. Charles II saw the whole thing as good, clean fun. But James believed his lustful appetite put his very soul in peril. So he continues, as the prophet David fell to adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband, so then other kings do fall. Henry VIII, his unnatural procedure to annul his marriages and place the succession away from Mary, Queen of Scots, being judged by God, who delivered the crown to James VI of Scotland, Mary's son. There was also the providential fate of his brother Charles, who had no children bar those of his mistresses, which included the vile, illegitimate nephew, James, Duke of Monmouth, who rebelled against his uncle in 1685. These are the punishments for the unlawful love of women. And James speaks knowingly, as having been, he concedes, blinded by such unlawful pleasures. The dangers of mistresses at court are also emphasized. The advice then continues to explore the correct behavior of a prince, a topic James was especially preoccupied with in his years of exile at Saint-Germain. Being true to religion is key to promoting loyalty, as whosoever is true to God must be so to his king, he said. Subjects should be ruled justly, and in a common expression he used throughout his writings, do as you would be done. Also, a prince must strive for liberty of conscience, as he had done. Do not force people to accept religion. People are to be gained, not frightened into it. However, once liberty of conscience is established, people will convert willingly to the Catholic faith. No wonder Protestants of all shades in England and Scotland were fearful. And in a revealing and rather fascinating passage of the advice, he declares England's habeas corpus legislation of 1679, that is no imprisonment without trial, a bad act and a misfortune to the people, as well as the crown, for it necessitates greater forces to police the people than would otherwise be needed. In his view, the act encouraged dissent and so oppression. No formal such act appeared in Scotland until 1701, a belated aspect of the revolution a decade earlier. But perhaps James was in some respects a misunderstood liberal. However, his son should never be without a considerable quantity of Catholic troops, without which you cannot be safe. Then and only then, he declared ominously, will people thank you for liberty of conscience. James then discusses how his son should govern his three kingdoms. His concept for Scotland within the imperial crown can be seen in this portrait by Nicholas de Larguieres of 1692, a Rococo portrait of St. Margaret, the 11th century Queen of Scotland. This devotional composition became the symbolic centerpiece of James's art collection at Saint-Germain, and the link between God and the Stuart dynasty of the King of Scots, the longest surviving dynasty in European history. In an anonymous treatise of advice to a Catholic king of Great Britain, dated around 1710, it's found in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. We see a reflection on James's understanding of legitimacy. It says, the royal family is originally of the Scots nation. It is therefore very natural to expect they should be more zealous and affectionate to the king's interests than any of his other subjects. Therefore, the ancient royal line of kings of Scots and the divinity of the right to rule with a closeness to God is underscored by St. Margaret, a prince and a saint, the better symbol of his right to rule and the advantages of obedience. James began a political geographical tour of the British Isles, and he first advises on England and Ireland, but for Scotland, his prescription is remarkable for its detail. Take all care to let no alterations be made in the government of that kingdom. They will stand by the crown. And in spite of past rebellions, the nobility and gentry and the generality of the commons are very loyal, he says. Trust none but the ancient loyal families that have no taint of Presbyterianism. And be kind to the clans, for they will fight for you. And so most of them did for James, his son and grandson, although in increasingly smaller numbers up to the 1745 rebellion. On the parliamentary union of Scotland and England, such a hot topic, of course, in the 21st century with the independence referendum in 2014, and another one on the way, it seems, James had passively supported the idea when it was fleeting a policy of his brother Charles. After the revolution, though, he made very clear his opposition to it. So in the advice, James states, "It is the true interest of the crown to keep the kingdom separate from England. Those who support union should be seen as weak men bribed by some private concern. If it's submitted into England, as in the time of Cromwell, Scotland as a great supporter of the crown would be lost forever." Union clashed with James's ideas of an imperial union of the crowns, where the person of the monarch would protect Scottish interests and ensure its merchants access to the colonies, such as his own territories in and around New York. The notion that the monarch would protect Scotland in the union of the crowns was the great and often unfulfilled royalist hope of the 17th century, to be frank. The last passage of the advice is incomplete and confirms there was a plan for a longer text. But at this point, James advises his son on selecting the best ministers and officers of state. The general tone appears to be balanced and moderate. For example, for the two English secretaries of state, one should be Catholic, the other Protestant. The Secretary of War should be Catholic, the Secretary of the Navy Protestant. But the army, household and bedchamber should be mostly Catholics. So ideas of the tolerant attitude of James are both undermined and supported by the evidence from the text of the advice to his son. James's advice confirms why in practical political terms he failed to show sufficient drive to retake his kingdoms. And this is his predominant attitude once in exile. He saw misfortune, and especially the rebellion of 1689, as a judgment on his personal behavior. Just as God delivered his survival on the battlefields of Europe in the 1650s, the sea campaigns against the Dutch in the 1660s and 70s, the crown in 1685, and perhaps most remarkably, a son and heir in 1688, so the same God took his thrones from him. James's faith explains his response to the political events. James never realized that his religion was the problem, and he was unable to reconcile his apparent belief in liberty of conscience with his religious objectives. So the enemy was, for most contemporary Scots, was not so much absolutism, for what was Charles II, if not an absolutist, but Catholic absolutism. Meanwhile, the advice in his general letters show him a little erratic enthusiasm for things Scottish, but aware of the political importance of the Scottish crown and the Edinburgh Parliament. Indeed, from 1673, he became much more involved in Scottish affairs than either his brother or father had ever been. But he believed in the imperial union of the crowns. He was only a Scottish nationalist, if you like, out of convenience. Yet he believed in the roots of his family and the dynasty. As it says admiringly in James's life, in one of the most apposite yet brief statements, Scotland, quote, gave a king to England in 1685. And this, I would say, is little more than the sugary sentimentality Shakespeare gives to the English King Henry V in his recollection of his Welsh background. In terms of James's character, his life, his military memoirs, his devotional papers, and the advice, they show him to be an obsessive, a kind of modern man who would make sure his kitchen cupboard contents stood to attention. This was evident before and after the revolution. What's the evidence? In 1685, he produced a complex and lengthy list of instructions for the servants of his bedchamber, with precedence, supervisory roles, dispute resolution, and who should carry a candle before him. In the same year, when the Scottish Parliament met, James issued a veritable blitzkrieg of instructions to his parliamentary manager, the Duke of Queensberry. Having managed the assembly himself in 1689, of course, he considered himself an expert. Indeed, the level of detail is extraordinary, with a list of 41 instructions and followed with an additional 11 sets of instructions. In 1696, the Earl of Perth governor to the exiled Prince of Wales and future Old Pretender, was given a 28-point set of instructions on how to bring up the royal boy, including point 14, which states, none must be permitted to whisper to or run into corners with the prince. Well, later in 1700, as we have already noted, James took time to pen a series of instructions on how officers of foot or horse and a general of forces should conduct themselves, with details of drill periods, scouting out the enemy, the best location for camps, and the correct times for troops to rise and retire. He was a compulsive obsessive, in other words. Okay, but should our judgment be entirely negative? In the modern period, we like to change our politicians regularly, don't we? Or as in the Italian saying, like babies' diapers, politicians should be changed regularly and for the same reasons. In the early modern period, the Pantheon of Monarchs came and went with few regrets from the population. When they died, 1603, Queen Elizabeth, 1625, James VI, 1685, Charles II, 1702, William of Orange, with few contemporaries much regretting the passing of kings and queens. And it's odd to reflect that the two who have a considerable literature celebrating their lives are Charles I and James VII. It would be like commemorating British Prime Ministers like John Major and Gordon Brown more than Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, who are much more successful and long in office. I'll leave you to consider the alike in presidential terms. At a personal level, James had a number of redeeming features. Physically, he was handsome, not short, a brilliant horseman, personally brave in combat situations, never short of female company. He was perhaps, and I won't be hung for this, like some in the British royal family today, not meant to be king. And he was too honest and loyal to master the necessary pragmatism required of a political manager, like his brother. He is supposed to have had some medical crisis or malady, a collapse to explain his run into exile in 1688-89. But there was no illness or syphilis or whatever, and that is now discounted. Indeed, the weaknesses of the man were there when he was young. He also had some qualities of a medieval king, and one senses, as I've suggested before, that he and James IV would have enjoyed a drink and a chat, being military men who revelled in the company of soldiers, and also kings who demanded unquestionable loyalty. They both failed. Most recent biographies have continued the success versus failure debate, broadly agreeing with Hutton that James is revealed for good evidence to have been ham-fisted, opinionated, inept, and disastrous. Some of this is oversimplified, but it's probably fair to sum him up as follows. After a bright start, in later life, he became obsessed with explaining his fate, and religion was the answer. He was not incompetent, merely sinful. James was a good soldier who became a modest general and a failed prince who ended a satisfied Catholic. He also saw himself as Scottish by birthright, an additional factor that is generally missed out in histories of his life. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Alastair. I can't tell you how fascinating that was and how happy we are to have you to talk with us. I'd like to open the floor for question and answer, please. Let's have some dialogue with Professor Mann.
Is that a hand up from Diane, is it? So I'm not sure if I'm to police this, but Diane, you're muted. Hello?
we're waiting for Diane, I have a question. This might be a little bit off topic, but I'm wondering what occurred that made Saint Margaret a saint in the late 1600s?
Yeah, she was related to in the 11th century. She was related to Edward the Confessor and the English royal family. She married Malcolm Canmore, one of the Scottish kings, and brought various monks up from England to ply their faith in Scotland. And she had lived a pious life, and her relics were seen as, you know, along with St. Columba, it was the other side of the church in Scotland. That's the, if you like, the Celtic church, St. Columba, whereas St. Margaret represented the Roman church. So you see the two kind of strands. And yeah, and you know, as I say, her relics were seen as special, you know, typical sort of reliquary taken into battle at Bannockburn, that kind of thing. So yeah, so she was seen as a saint. You know, I mean, why is anybody a saint? That she had a life of St. Margaret was written by somebody a generation older, and that persisted in manuscript form, circulated, and no doubt her connection with the English royal family helped as well, I guess. Scotland needed a saint, England had one, we needed one too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask one more question while I have the floor here. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the mythical King Fergus. I'm going to have to do some research.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, have any of you been to Holyrood Abbey and seen, sorry, Holyrood Palace rather, and seen the portraits that I'm talking about? Yeah, you see that, yeah, I mean, you can see the damage. Some of them have been, you know, where English soldiers stuck a knife in, and this kind of, you can see the kind of repair, the patch. Yeah, I mean, sorry, what was your question again? Come at me, I've lost it.
Just a little bit on the mythical King Fergus.
Yeah. I mean, part of this idea is supposed to be a connection between the movement of the Celts from Egypt. And there's a mythology that is within late medieval and early modern histories of Scotland by people like Hector Boas, George Buchanan, and so on. Even George Buchanan, Mary Queen of Scots tutor, and of course James's tutor, James VI tutor, and ultimately a Protestant, of course. The Reformation, they still peddle this idea that Pharaoh's daughter Scotus was the kind of root of Celtic migration through Ireland up through. The Scots came from Ireland, so you get this kind of idea. Spain, Ireland, Scotland, and so forth. And Fergus is some mythical king who's supposed to have existed. But if you think about it, Scotland, when the Romans were there, was a series of tribes and peoples. So there wasn't a kind of, sorry? Somebody's talking now. There wasn't a kind of king of Scots in the land of Scotland until the 7th century. So, you know, there's a kingdom of Strathclyde, for example, it's completely separate, you know. And it was, you know, Glasgow and down south of Glasgow, Ayrshire, that kind of area. The Picts and the Scots, separate grouping. The Picts, my goodness, you know, a huge people. I mean, you might almost think that they're reminiscent of Neanderthal man in the fact that they've kind of disappeared. But of course, if you've toured the northeast of Scotland, you know well how many places there are within place names with Pict in them. So, you know, they're there. They're there. Sorry.
Thank you.
I thought somebody was going to ask me about the Scottish referendum and whether I thought that it would happen or not, or who would win, and all the rest of it. Or how I've dealt with the fact that I'm half English and half Scots and all that kind of nonsense. You know?
I'll jump in there, Alastair.
Oh, okay, Gus, thank you.
My parents are Geordies, and I was born and brought up in Duns in the Borders, so I have sympathy for your blended.
Well, as you well know, Gus, Geordies are kind of honorary Scots, aren't they, really? So it's fun.
That's right. I have two questions. The first is, if you look behind me, you'll see a guitar, and I'm looking behind you and I see a guitar. So I want to know what kind of guitar you have.
I have an Epiphone. It's quite old. It got damaged actually because our house was broken into and my car was stolen a number of years ago, and a rock was thrown in and it bounced on my guitar. We were all fine. We were actually in Nova Scotia when it happened, which is remarkably, but there we go. But I decided it's a badge of honor. It's got a slight damage on it, you know. So I played the guitar a lot when I was younger. When I was very young, I used to sing in a band, believe it or not, which is kind of weird, really. And I had hair longer than Anne Walker's is. So there you go. But we want, as you can see, my hair has moved to my chin. But anyway, and also I've got a bit of hand trouble since I've got a bit of arthritis in my fingers. So I thought I'd take up guitar lessons in order to help. And it has helped. So there you go. So that's why I've started. But my two sons are musicals. So, go on, Dad, get on with it kind of thing. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you for the question. Don't ask me to play something, for God's sake, because that could be a disaster. This is being recorded, remember. My reputation is on the cards here, anyway.
Did you play in a band in Stirling? I did.
No, I played in Aberdeen.
Okay.
Yeah. There you go.
It was because of my band in Stirling that I now live in Chicago. It's a roundabout story.
I see.
I'll go right to the conclusion of the story, which is the guitar player in the band in Stirling was Ronnie Valentine. And the guitar player in my band in Scotland is John Valentine. They're brothers. And
right.
We figured the most logical thing two Scots in Chicago could do is form a honky-tonk band. And
right. Okay.
Johnny Cash and other figures.
Well, I'm a little older than you, so I'm kind of, I mean, it was okay to play Beatles songs when I was doing it, so a little bit of David Bowie and that kind of stuff. But no, my two sons play their own songs. They think all that cover stuff is all nonsense. So I hold my hand up. They're fabulous. So that's absolutely fine. No, it's interesting about Stirling. Have any of you been to the area? Do you know Stirling? I mean, apart from you guys, obviously. I mean, it's very interesting. It's not just the castle and Braveheart country and all that stuff, but also if you look at medieval maps, right? And I recently did a lecture on ancient Rome in Scotland as well, so reflecting on that too, and how important this area is, because as you may know, if you look at the map of Scotland, you've got the Clyde coming in on the west and the Forth coming in on the east, and they meet pretty much in the middle. And literally, Stirling was the bridging point of how you get from the south to the north, right? And if you think about Bannockburn and how the English army's heavy cavalry and heavy knights were struggling in the mud and the bog, well, that's because mud and bog was a feature of a lot round about Stirling. And this is why the Battle of Stirling Bridge was where, you crossed. And the medieval maps actually call this the Sea of Scotland, believe it or not, between the north and the south. So all you had to do to get away from the Romans was run across into the hills and Scarpa. And then, so the Romans put their forts along the edge, realizing that you couldn't, you couldn't beat the Scots. You just had to keep them back. Simple as that. Anyway, there you go. So the Jacobites did the similar sort of stuff. They ran away and so forth.
Alastair, the other question I had was related to your the work you'll be doing on the Privy Council, Could you talk about how that came up and what the work will be?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. It's a project that I've been talking about for 20 years now, to be honest. And it's very ironic to get such a huge grant months after I retire. And I'm back there. But yeah, it's because of a couple of factors. The council was abolished in 1708, and the year after the union of the parliaments. And it was abolished for political reasons to do with party politics in Scotland. I mean, you know, it's typical, blame the English or whatever, it's all rubbish. It was actually Scottish politicians that did for it. Because those that didn't have jobs, didn't have posts, thought that it was just a vehicle for patronage for those in power. However, clearly not having a council made it very difficult to cope with Jacobitism on the ground for 50 years, which is a problem. Anyway, back in the 1960s, the last printed volume of the printed records of the Privy Council was published, and they ran out of money. And that took us up to 1691, okay? So historians looking at the record are frustrated because the 1690s up to 1708 is a fascinating period. I mean, you've got the Darien scheme. I don't know if you all know about this. The attempt to set up a colony at Panama. You've got the Great Famine of the 1690s, where more people die in Scotland than in the Black Death in the 14th century. You've got the Union of the Parliaments itself. You've got the managing Scotland, which is such a problem that leads to the Union in the first place. You've got many other issues that are absolutely fascinating. And historians are digging around with lots of random papers and so on. And, you know, very difficult handwriting, etc., etc. And to be honest, even some of the best historians in Scotland have hardly looked at it because they've been lazy, to be honest. Some of the best professors have been lazy. However, what happened was 1960s typescripts were produced for publication in old-fashioned 1960s typewriters. You know, that kind of blue ink on foolscap pages that some of you might be old enough to remember this kind of stuff, you know, mechanical stuff and so on. Absolutely goddamn hopeless, really. But with modern scanning techniques, it's possible to scan those and put them into a Word file, and we can make a kind of foundation record. We can do half the work of editing this very quickly, or at least the transcription work anyway. So we still got to do a lot of typing and so on, but we've halved it. And so what we're producing, because this is the 21st century, is an online resource of the record from 1691 to 1708. So historians can look at economic, social, religious involvement. And of course, because it deals with the day-to-day, unlike Parliament that maybe met for 2 or 3 months a year, it's there every week. So it has to react to a bridge going down somewhere in a flood, which has to be, funds have to be raised to replace it. You know, a congregation that steals the keys to the lock of a church because the congregation don't like the minister, the Privy Council to step in, and you know, a poor widow who appears to the of a military officer who appeals to the Privy Council for help because her family is starving. All sorts of stuff it gets involved with in minute detail, and we've got a window to all that. So that's what we're doing, and there are 7 of us that are recruited, and we're working on it now. And it's an interesting, and also I don't know if any of you probably all worked with Scotland's People, have you? You know, the online resource where you can see your Scotland background that the National Records of Scotland run online. Part of that is a resource called the Records of the Parliaments of Scotland. We call it RPS, okay? And it's the Records of the Scottish Parliament from 1230 to 1707. And I'm one of the editors of that. I worked in that project for 10 years. So that is a template for the Privy Council thing. And you're like, you can type in your surname, you know, back to Anne Walker again. You can type in the name Walker in that resource, and it throws up all these 15th century, 17th century dudes called Walker. Where did they live? They lived in Falkirk, they lived in Inverness, etc., etc. it's absolutely fascinating stuff. And this gives us another opportunity to do online searching in over a 20-year period. It's a much smaller resource. If it takes 10 years, if I'm not dead, I'll probably blow my brains out. But it's you know, it'll be a 3-year project. So it's a smaller scale, but it's a kind of mini version of that. And hopefully useful for people, useful for historians, but also people like yourself wanting to find out what, did you have anybody who's known to have died in the famine who might have been, or somebody who was a merchant who was interested in, who was a council member for a borough council who was appealing on something or other, involved in tax raising? There's all sorts of things that you might be able to find out. Who knows? Anyway, thank you for asking. And wow. Perhaps I should put a hat round afterwards. Anyway, I've actually recruited 4 people I've never met, because the project started on the 1st of October and we've been either in lockdown or unable to go on campus. So I have literally seen some of them for as much as I've seen you. Or no, not you, but Connie, virtually. Anyway, you know, which is not ideal, is it? I mean, I don't know if you've been doing similar things in your lives. Some of you will be retired and some working, but you know, it's not the best way to recruit or get to know people, is it? I mean, we're all doing it. We are what I call zombies, you know, pretty much, but there we go. Thank you for asking.
Other
Jody,
questions? Yes, please.
I think Jody may have had a question.
Yes, I'm curious to know if Scotland has a unique history of the development of books and printing.
Well, yes, it does, in all sorts of complicated ways. I mean, it certainly got printing about 30 years after England did, okay? But its first press is from 1505 to 7, which is pretty early. It developed, well, yeah, you have to see it in a trajectory which is long. If you take the Scottish Enlightenment, for example, in the 18th century, when publishing was enormous out of Edinburgh, and indeed people deliberately tried to use Edinburgh printers and publishers to publish their work. It was quite remarkable. And it's not just a function of it, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Adam Smith, the printers, Adam Smith, you know, how do you, famous Enlightenment figures, David Hume, people like this, who were read throughout Enlightenment Europe and America at the time. So yeah, but if you go back, it has its own particular history. It has its own binding styles, where books have this kind of herringbone appearance. It's typical Scottish book binding. It has its own genre connected to literature. Does anybody know what flighting is? Flighting is a sort of insulting poetry joust, where you get 2 poets who shout insults at each other in a poetic way. Well, that's a genre invented in Scotland, which features in the 16th century. It's quite remarkable, really. So yeah, I mean, you know, we have medieval poets, for example, you know, Barber's the Bruce, Harry's the Wallace. Harry's Wallace, for example, is the kind of book that you'd have by your bedside along with the Bible in the 16th and 17th centuries. You'd have it there, you know. And you know, both books with all the, you know, Harry's Wallace was a commissioned work in the 15th century with an anti-English feel to it. So if you were a Scot and patriot, you'd think, oh yeah, this is great stuff. Damn the English, bunch of sods, you know, kind of thing. So reading this would you know, give you a feeling of literature and a feeling of pride at the same time. And of course, it was done in the Scots vernacular, which is also a unique side to this. And it was the predominant printed language in Scotland until the 17th century of what was printed here. But look, let's face it, a little bit like manufactures. The demand for Scotland is all, apart from building ships, which we did in the 19th century and stuff like that, the demand for manufactures and the demand for books is always greater than the supply that Scotland could ever do. So we always imported more than we exported because our education system had a high literacy rate and people, so, you know, we got a lot of our Bibles from Holland, for example, English language Bibles from Holland, Latin Bibles, medical texts, and a lot of stuff from England too, you know, as well. So yeah, but the printing business is interesting. And what I noticed when I did my PhD on the book trade, I noticed that there was a gap, that nobody had done an individual study of the Scottish book trade between 1500 and 1750. So no brainer for me. That's what I did.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Well, you know, friends, I think we're just about out of time. And maybe that's an excellent segue to inviting Alastair back again in the very near future so that we can continue our dialogue with him. But Alastair, I just don't know how to thank you. This has just been so fascinating. Yes, we can applaud. And I do want to remind you to please let us know if you and your wife are coming over here to Chicago.
As I say, we have friends who are not too far from you. Don't ask me the exact place. I can't remember, but fortunately, I have a wife who's a better compass than me, so it's possible. I might one day in the next 2 or 3 years be able to come and meet you all personally. But that would be a pleasure.
I believe it's highly probable.
I would be delighted to talk about something different and something less, maybe less intense, because as you could probably tell, I don't dress like James VII, but I'm a bit, it's probably a bit long grass to some of you, I suspect. But listen, I spent 5 years in the damn guy, so it explains it really. But I'm quite happy to talk about other things. I'm a parliamentary historian as well, which is something that, given the politics of the world and the politics of then and now, and how things developed about home rule, and how we talk about devolution and so on, and how, I mean, if you just look at where we live, you've probably, those who've been in the Stirling area have seen the Wallace Tower, for example, you know, the national monument to William Wallace. How is it that Unionists and Nationalists were able to raise the money for that tower? That's an interesting question. What? How could Garibaldi think it's a good idea? And, you know, absolutely loyal Unionists, Conservatives, Tories think it's a good idea as well. That's an interesting topic in its own. So, yeah. Anyway, listen, it's been a pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It was nice to see you all. And good luck. I think I was reading up about what you do. I'm very impressed. You guys do great work. And keep it up. And I'll have an eye on what you're up to now. Now I found your website. So that's fine.
We'll count you as one of us moving forward, Alastair. Think of yourself as a Chicago Scot.
Okay.
So, and before we conclude, I want to thank Jack Sanders, who is supporting us. We historians. So Jack, thank you for everything you're doing for us. And also, I would like to remind you, and hope you'll all join next month on August 7th for David Forlow's talk on his recent book that he co-authored with Wayne Redford, by the way, about the Illinois Scots on the North Shore. Same time, same station. And we can go ahead and bring the formal part of the meeting to adjournment, I believe. I think we're just about out of time. It's grand to see you here today. Thank you for your support of Scottish culture in America. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month. And Alastair, we're going to see you and your wife soon, I promise.
Okay, you're on.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.